Starting healthy stream. Hello folks, this is our normal Monday evening Carl Jung Depth Psychology reading group, and I want to begin tonight by playing for you a short video called Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology, and it will start with some of the ideas that I'd like to chat with you on the chat and with my friend John, who is here with me. And so I'll start the video and then come back to you in about 8 minutes. I'm reading from Liberating the Heart, Spirituality and Jungian Psychology by Lawrence Jaffe. And Dr. Jaffe was a practicing Jungian analyst in Berkeley, California. So I'm reading from a chapter entitled Individuation, page 22. And the title of this section is called The Religious Attitude, Careful Consideration. The word religion comes from Latin religere, meaning the careful consideration of what comes to us, that is, our experience. This is Jung's departure point, and it explains why he begins to look, despite his protestations, like the prophet of a new kind of religion. Traditional religion posits, quote, "If you believe, you will have the experience of God," unquote. Jung turns this around. He says, quote, "If you have the experience of God, or the self, you will believe, or more precisely, you will know." And how do you have an experience of God? By paying attention to what comes your way in life, making the assumption that it belongs to you, especially what is negative and takes you by surprise. So let me read that sentence again because it's a very important one. How do you have an experience of God? By paying attention to what comes your way in life, making the assumption that it belongs to you, especially what is negative and takes you by surprise. Whatever in life shocks or surprises us is likely a part of our own nature, which has become split off from awareness and returns into consciousness with an alien and negative face, as most things of people do who have been excluded or repressed. Difficulties in relationships, for example, are a rich source of information about ourselves, but if these difficulties enable us to learn more about ourselves and improve ourselves, we will be doing God's work. That is the message of this book. Quote, "Life has gone out of the churches," unquote. Jung once said, quote, "and it will never go back. The gods will not reinvest dwellings that once they have left," unquote. As its next dwelling place, the Holy Spirit appears to have selected the human individual. "It seems to me," wrote Jung, "to be the Holy Spirit's task and charge to reconcile and reunite the opposites in the human individual through a special development of the human soul." The psychological term for that development is the transcendent function, which points to the capacity of the psyche to unite conscious and unconscious contents, giving rise to a new attitude. That new attitude, insofar as it represents the assimilation into consciousness of what was formerly unconscious, is the psychological equivalent of the birth of Christ, the incarnation of God. Jungian or analytical psychology seeks to institute and support the dialogue between conscious and unconscious, the transcendent function, which generates that special development of the human soul the incarnation, the realization of the divine being in human life. The transcendent function, notes Jung, is a natural and spontaneous phenomenon, part of the process of individuation. And he adds these moving words, quote, "Psychology has no proof that this process does not unfold itself at the instigation of God's will." There's a footnote. This is from a letter to Père Lachat, Père meaning the French for father, so I presume this is a Catholic priest. Letter to Père Lachat, The Symbolic Life, Collected Works 18, paragraph 1554. Now, one of the reasons that I have come to the conclusion that the keepers of Dr. Jung's flame have hidden his religious work is because this letter to which Dr. Jaffe refers is not contained in the collected works, the two-volume collected works of C.G. Jung, and it is only in volume 18, which is a volume that most readers will never get to. So that's my opinion on that. Carrying on. Jesus' words, "The kingdom of God is within you," are being realized in our day. Many people must find a relationship to the religious attitude through their own individual experience. They cannot accept dogmatic assertions. As Jung writes, man's relation to God probably has to undergo a certain important change. Instead of the propitiating praise to an unpredictable king, or the child's prayer to a loving father, the responsible living and fulfilling of the divine will in us will be our form of worship of and commerce with God. Depth psychology, supporting the dialogue between conscious and unconscious, can help us to understand and interpret our own experience and live our own hypothesis. To the extent that we can achieve this, we make a contribution, however small, toward helping God incarnate in this world. Experience now supplants faith. Only individual experience is of sufficient weight to counterbalance the dictates of scientism and materialism. These twin furies continually whisper that the individual is of negligible significance except as part of a group. The idea that there is anything of worth within an individual is dismissed. Subjective experience, a judge now of little value, is equivalent to the stone that the builders rejected, which is destined nevertheless to become the cornerstone of the new church, a church of the individual's experience of God incarnating within. This is the momentous task of the coming age, that value and dignity should be restored to the human individual. That's the end of the section I was reading from Liberating the Heart, Spirituality, and Jungian Psychology by Dr. Lawrence W. Jaffe and published by Inner City Books.
Here.
Pardon?
You need the Liberating the Heart again?
No, I don't.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
So, here we are back, and I hope that was an interesting video for you. We have one other member here in my office, and we have a few online, and so wonder if anyone has any thoughts about what Doctors Jaffe and Edinger and Jung said in this particular section of this book about individuation. I was asked earlier today how this worked, and I think that the key to it is this issue of man's relation to God, and this is the Jung quote that's here. Man's relation to God probably has to undergo a certain important change. Instead of the propitiating praise to an unpredictable king, or the child's prayer to a loving father, the responsible living and fulfilling of the divine will in us will be our form of worship of and commerce with God. And I'm wondering what any of you think of that. When Dr. Jung writes the propitiating praise, he means people running to God and tithing and making gifts and various kinds, or sacrificing their children in the old days. Those were all trying to praise God to let him have them get off their backs. And so we seem to have come past that stage, and we're certainly not in the stage of the child's prayer of praying to a loving father who's going to take care of us. And so we have to grow up and have this experience of God that Dr. Jung is talking about, which is in the psyche. And I know that that may not be very popular among theologians, but I'm not trying for popularity among theologians, honestly. I'm just trying to get my camera so that it's not blocking my view of the chat here. And so anyway, we have Gray has some more comments on the opposites. I had worship today on top of a Blue Ridge mountain in North Carolina. Well, describe that to us, Gray. This is the time of year for it, when people are celebrating what? Yesterday was Palm Sunday, right? So we have Good Friday, so-called Good Friday, coming up this Friday. And was your worship having to do with the Easter story, or what was it involved with? I'm just wondering about that. Obviously, when we go up on the top of a mountain or go next to the sea or whatever it is, we can feel God in certain places, spaces. As I've talked about a couple times, I find the chapel at the U.S. Naval Academy to be a sacred space for me. But John was talking about the Russian Orthodox Church.
Very mystical space, a sacred space, beautiful sacred space, yes.
Right, and so are you conscious of the archetypes when you're there, John? Or
Well, I think you can feel them. Mm-hmm. And you can feel the ancient Russian ghosts almost, you know. It's a Byzantine combination of Byzantine and Russian culture, so there are all those rich, very historic, old, ancient symbols that permeate with the icons. Mm-hmm. It's very dark, it's very black, mm-hmm. but it's very bright also, so you have the contrast because you have the bright candles all over the place.
I see.
And it's reflecting off of the gold icons, so mm-hmm. it's very, very laden with mystery, I would say. Mm-hmm. Mystery of the ages.
Yeah.
In fact, they used the expression unto the ages of ages quite a lot.
And that's what religion has always been all about, has been looking back to the way things have been done in the past. And I thought, one thing I thought about Jordan Peterson and his description of religion is, or a savior, if you will, is where if you do something that's good for yourself, and then it's good for your family, and then it's good for your grouping, and then it's good for your village, and then it's good for your country, let's say, and then it's good for all humanity, and it's good now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. If you can do something like that that meets good in all those parameters, then that is a superhero.
Well, and the Russian Orthodox Church is full of feast days, and there's a cycle of services that, with a morning service and evening service, and then the Sunday early prayer, which is called matins, and then the Sunday main service. But throughout the seasons, there are cycles and patterns that repeat. So it gives you the feeling of a permanence that I never felt with the Catholic Church, or especially Protestant churches. So it's unique to that church.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to find in a Protestant church, but I do have to say that, when I was going to the Reformed Church on a regular basis, to the point where I became a deacon in the church, I really would feel, and I didn't understand why, now I think I do, but at the time, I would go to church, and I didn't know why, but after I went to church, I would feel better. And now I understand by studying Dr. Jung that what the church is doing is getting you in touch with that ego-self axis and connecting you looking back to your history and so on. And even as I've been doing other things in my life, I was very negative about I was negative about both of my grandfathers. One of them because I thought that he was an alcoholic and he basically killed himself with liquor. That's what I thought. And the other because he was a premier bigot. He was born the same year Custer had his last stand, believe it or not, in 1881. So he was a pretty old guy. He was 47 the year my mother was born, and he lived until she was 50. So wow. He lived to be 97, so he was a crusty old dude. But anyway, as I've been doing some of my other activities, not my Jungian activities per se, but the Jungian activities have made me go back and look at my paternal grandfather, the one that was the alcoholic, and I put myself in his shoes. And basically, he was born in 1900, and so he was 29 years old when the Great Depression started, when the big crash in 1929 happened. And he had built a correspondence school, as it happens, that was based on literally writing letters and sending things back and forth in the mails. And that business got totally crushed in the crash. And then he was unable to find work for many years. And finally, he became a traveling salesman. And I think he had some other job during the Depression and the war, but after the war, so he would have been in his early 50s after the war, he started to be a traveling salesman and used to go around selling hardware to hardware stores on a wholesale basis, right? And because he was traveling 5 days a week, he would take up with other women, and he would get himself drunk in the evening or drink too much in the evening. And he really became the archetype of Eugene O'Neill's Death of a Salesman, Willie Loman. And that's the way I saw him for most of my life. And he had a stroke when he was 58, died when he was 68. Um, and But now, looking back and looking at some of the experiences of my own life, I say, wow, he really suffered a lot. And
you probably really identify with the play then.
well, I'm not sure I identify the play anymore because I haven't read the play since I was in high school. But anyway, let's see. Grace says, Grace says, I was reading the Red Book for Our Time, Dr. Owen's essay named Jung and the Prophet Puzzle. That's a very interesting one, of course, because although I'm not sure Jung saw himself as a prophet per se, obviously there were many prophetic things in the Red Book. And actually, I heard a webinar with Dr. Owens about 2 weeks ago, and I had a email exchange with him because I had come up with this insight that the Jungians, the official Jungians, had actually hidden the religious aspects of Dr. Jung's work. And it was only when I read Dr. Edinger's book, The New God Image, which I was reading today for video, that I realized that they had really deep-sixed his religious teachings, so that I think the rationale was that psychotherapy was a fledgling profession, and they didn't want to be taking slings and arrows from the churches all the time. And so he admitted it. Lance Owens admitted to me that that's what they did. They hid the religious aspects of Dr. Jung's oeuvre. So that's one of the reasons why I'm now focusing on it a bit, because I think that we've got very incorrect and very problematic ideas about religion across the world, not only in the United States, but everywhere. And unless we start to realize what religion is really about, and the fact that, oh, by the way, all religions at base are the same. They have the same archetypal events going on in them. And so we really don't need to be killing one another over them. If anything, we should be listening to one another and trying to learn what is good about other religions, because obviously there are beneficial things that you can get from other religious ideas. Go ahead, John.
So I have a question for you then. I was reading a letter by Jung today where he was talking about the Pharisees. And he mentioned how the old pre-Christian era Judaism was about the law, and it was focused on the law, and it was very slice and dice with regard to regulation of behavior and that sort of thing.
Right.
And is that kind of what you're talking
Right.
about? Is that we're headed back toward that
We're headed toward a way of rigidity in religions, but not only in religions. It's also what Jordan Peterson is doing with his psychological talk when he's talking about all logos. He's saying everything has to be logos. Well, no, it doesn't. He has, obviously, in 20 years of psychotherapy practice, he's probably had 100 cases at least of every possible thing that could go wrong in human relationship. And so over the course of that and his practice, he undoubtedly came up with rules that are what is best and what is best not to do in a relationship. But that doesn't help you. because maybe you're different. I mean, I had a divorce that blew, a first marriage after 17 years that blew up, and I went to a psychotherapist for 5 times, and I actually wanted him to give rules, okay, and he didn't want to do that. So, I said to him, well, how does this end? What is, what's supposed to happen in this process to get us through this? And he said, I don't know. And so I mean, in a sense, that's probably kind of a Jungian approach, which is he's putting it back on us, my ex-wife and I, to talk it through. But he was giving us no handles, okay? And at the same time, giving too rigid handles also isn't the right answer. And so there has to be a balance between.
Well, pastoral counseling is kind of like a middle ground between those two, usually.
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
It serves a good purpose.
Right, right. So, hi, Miles. Welcome back. Hi, Jerome. Euripides' Ghost. Jung's work seems more relevant today than ever. Absolutely. And, I took on a Facebook group about last summer that had been started by someone else, and then they asked me to take it over. And it's called Jung's Collected Works for Beginners. And I wasn't terribly interested in it because I have 3 other Facebook groups, but all of a sudden that group has 5 to 10 people almost every day wanting to join that group, and I'm being forced to spend more time with it as a result of that fact. And so it's very interesting. And my friend Louis LaFontaine, who runs the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Facebook page, and now he's created a Carl Jung Depth Psychology YouTube channel, not to be confused with ours, because ours is the Reading Group channel. But Louis tells me that he gets about a million hits a month on Pinterest. And on the Facebook group, when I joined that group in about 2005, it had about 4,000 members. So I thought, well, okay, this is probably pretty much the Jungians in the world, right? But now, 13 years later, it's got 62,000 members. And so it's huge. Now, a lot of that is people that just want to read Jungian quotes. And if you go over to Lewis's YouTube channel, which I would recommend you take a look at, basically what Lewis does is he publishes Jung quotes in the form of videos. So he's got these memes, and he plays music, and the memes with the Jung quotes go by. But it's useful. I don't know that it takes you into depth, though. But it's certainly true that there's a tremendous need that people feel for something. I don't know if they know that they need Jungian psychology, but they're looking for something, obviously. And so there's more and more of them, and obviously this YouTube channel has been gaining members. We're now gaining approximately 200 members a month, so that's pretty incredible compared to where we were. So Jerome says, have you seen Jonathan Pageau's YouTube channel on Orthodox theology and iconology and his interviews with Jordan Peterson? No, I've not seen that, Jerome, but thank you for bringing it to my attention. I'll definitely check that out tomorrow. Miles says there are versus calling us to live in submission to one another, seems to me this means not hitting each other over the head by our holy books. Well, it certainly means that at the minimum. And I think that what Jung taught me, because he went back to the basis of all religions and found that they're all pretty much based on the same ideas. And so that gives us a handle to think that maybe we should go back and think about how we can learn from the other religions, because we can learn things, there's no doubt. I mean, obviously, even Islam, although it's been terribly maligned in the U.S. media, actually there are a lot of good things in Islam. In the Muslim countries I've been in, I find them very family-oriented places. And, what could be wrong with praying 5 times a day? I mean, that's a good idea. I think the Buddha would approve. Go ahead, John.
I wanted to say something about Jerome's comment about iconography.
Right.
That in the Orthodox Church, it's very interesting that the iconographers consider painting an icon an act of prayer.
Oh, absolutely.
So as they're painting, they're actually praying in images, which is very Jungian, and it's sort of what I do with my dreams, too. When I'm painting them, there's a reverence and a sacredness to making this image.
Yeah, and that's the way it should be, and I certainly do that. And I have we have a lot of Buddhist iconography in my house because my wife is a Buddhist teacher. She's not officially a Lama, but she went to a 3-year retreat, which amounts to divinity school for Buddhism, and so she's now one of the leading Buddhist teachers in the Washington area. So, for example, if I spin the camera over this way, you'll see an image of the Buddha on her filing cabinet, and that's a Buddha that's in a temple in Hawaii. And you also see a Japanese bell, which is a very Buddhist thing. And in Tibetan Buddhism, they have skip my mind for a moment. What's the tankas? They have tankas, which are Tibetan Buddhist images that are supposed to evoke certain ideas. And when you look at these things, at one level they're showing gods and goddesses and dakinis, which are female attendants to the gods and so on. But at another level, if you unfocus your vision on them, they're really ribald. What's the word?
Ribald.
Ribald. In that they actually show union of naked people. And at some point, I had a Buddhist image where the Buddha is there meditating, and there's a feminine character who's supposed to be his anima in terms of Jungian psychology, but you turn this thing over and it's anatomically correct. And it's actually showing what Dr. Jung would call the conjunction, or the conjunctionis, which is what we're looking for, which is the conjunction of opposites. And so,
Thomas More talks a lot about
sexuality
as part of our sacred existence also, and
Right, absolutely.
the practice of it in terms of a concept.
Right, and the video we were talking about last week, Edward Edinger at American Jungian, 1994, he was talking about sexuality being the peak experience for us as biological beings. He says nature knows what she's doing, and she wants us to reproduce, and so she's basically making sexuality so attractive because she wants us to reproduce no matter what. And so that's the biological aspect. But what he was saying is that on the psychological side, it's actually the conjunctio that we're looking for, which is the bringing together of the opposites, and the bringing together of opposites in that sense in Buddhist theology also. Let's see, Euripides Go says, I am amazed at the degree of zeal and enthusiasm that supposedly non-religious people these days are infusing into their ideological relationship with the state, rules, policies, etc. He says, I'm a psychologist working with veterans, and I'm not Jungian trained, so I don't pretend to do any form of Jungian analysis, but I'm finding his concepts fascinating in relationship to trauma work. Well, as a mild sufferer of PTSD, I can tell you it's a very useful process. He goes on, I've found that beginning to read, study his work, I've invested in all of the writings in the Bollingen series. It is a nice counterpole to the cognitive behavioral approach. Well, I think that you will also find that with Jungian psychology, you're going much deeper. That, you know, the behavioral approach is, let's have a quick fix. Let's give you a 10-minute visit with your patient, and then off you go with your prescription for drugs or whatever it is. And we're not really solving psychological problems per se. We're just kind of papering them over. At least that's my reaction. And I'm not a psychologist, so you can correct me certainly if I'm telling tales out of school. But I would certainly say that Dr. Jung has gone much, much deeper. Well, basically what we can understand from the Red Book is, and from the references back to the Red Book, we can understand that Jung had visions that were probably on a greater order of magnitude than any of the biblical figures, with the possible exception of Job, although even that is a question. But, for example, Jacob's wrestling with the angel at the river Jabbok in Genesis, that was an event that occurred on one morning. And I don't know, how long did Paul's experience go?
Not sure, but there was John of Patmos who wrote the Revelation, which was very Jungian in a way.
Right. Okay. So John of Patmos wrote Revelation, and that was it must have been an extended visioning period because it's a very long book. But the others were relatively short. I guess Job had intermittent experiences with Yahweh, which were causing him to have boils or having his children to be killed or whatever it was that was happening at any given time to Job. But Jung, as a psychiatrist, as a professional psychiatrist, actually intentionally kept his visions going for 5 years, and then spent another 11 years beyond that and he was recording from a scientific perspective notebooks of his experiences that he was having. And then he spent another 11 years noting down what was happening. And so that's what we have in the Red Book. And then later in life, he was convinced that he needed to explain it a bit better. And so that's when he wrote Ion, which was his commentary on the Red Book period and what he had discovered over 40 years of clinical experience. He claimed that he had interpreted 80,000 dreams, I believe. And so I don't know if that's meaningful to you, what I said.
You mentioned Paul, though, Skip. Were you referring to Paul's conversion, or what?
Yeah, I was. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I was referring to the visioning event that he had on the road to Damascus, which was only one afternoon.
Very brief,
right? Yeah, it was very brief. And so most of these biblical figures had very brief visions or dreams. Abraham had a brief vision that God gave him the goat that he could sacrifice instead of his son Isaac. That was awfully good that he had that vision at that time, at least for Isaac.
But if you think about Paul, he must have had a long series of that thoughtful period where he had to probably have other visions, because he turned around 180 degrees.
Yes.
And he became fully individuated.
Right.
And it was a rather remarkable thing. I don't think that would happen with just one small conversion. One major conversion experience, but he had to.
I think you're right about that.
He must have had to develop things that were not in the Bible.
Yeah, and he was certainly talking about the opposites, because he was saying something like, the things that I don't want to do, I do. And other things
like write letters to the Corinthians and so forth. They were fighting amongst themselves.
Right, and so, but anyway, I think it's fascinating if you pick up Edward Edinger's work, which is 16 volumes. You start to get an appreciation. And the reason I started this session with Dr. Jaffe was that Dr. Jaffe was the interviewer of Edward Edinger, and he had mentioned his book in the interview. And so for those of you who don't know about this, I want to give you the transcript. Let's see. Oh, shoot. This should be easier. I want to give you the link to the Edinger interview between Jaffe and Edinger. Both men are dead. Edinger died in 1998. And Jaffe apparently died in 2003, but this interview took place in 1994, and it's really profound, and so I urge you to look at it, and I will provide you with the link to my transcript of this interview, and with it you'll see the actual interview itself, and it's truly a profound piece of work, and it was why I went and looked at Dr. Jaffe's work. And it's rather interesting because Dr. Jaffe was obviously born a Jew, and he says at the beginning of this book in the introduction that when he went to Israel the first time and only time apparently that he went there in his lifetime, he actually became Christ's brother. He felt he became Christ's brother, and he understood Christ, and he understood what Jung was getting at. And ultimately, I read his obituary today, and he was his funeral was in a Presbyterian church, which I thought was very interesting combination. But anyway, if you haven't looked at that interview, I urge you to do so. It's very powerful. And let's see. So Jerome says Pajot's day job is creating and furnishing icons to various Orthodox churches. And I think that Dr. Jung would think that that is a very healthy activity. And what I've found in my own experience is that when I've done artistic things, and I actually include within the artistic things the production of this YouTube channel now, that this has become my artistic activity, my creative activity. But in the past, I have done writing and I've done painting. And when I do, my life seems to go better. I don't know why, but it just seems to go better. And it's something that's happening in the unconscious. The unconscious understands that I'm listening to it. And when I started, I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. But obviously, I do understand that now. And I think that the fundamental issue for Jungian psychology is that Jung was talking about the self and the God image pushing out from the depths, from our deepest psychic position in every human mind as the deepest archetype. And fundamentally, what one needs to understand is that archetypes play like a record. And once they are constellated, you have potential for the archetypes at any time to be constellated. In other words, somebody's picked it out of the jukebox for one reason or another. But once it starts to play, it won't stop. It does not stop. And so when the self is constellated, which is this very deep God image that we all have, then you're forced to do things. And if you don't do them, you find yourself having various problems. I mean, Dr. Jung and Dr. James Hollis and Edinger all talked about having automobile accidents and tripping down stairs and things because your unconscious isn't happy, so it intentionally causes you to have accidents. And in my case, it happened. I mean, I'm still wearing my boot from my ankle replacement, but I had my broken leg 28 years ago, and it was the last thing I did in uniform as a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps. And I had visions of becoming a reserve general in the Marine Corps. I was a reserve officer for 20 of my 23 years, but there are 10 reserve generals in the Marine Corps, and I was hoping to be one of them, and I was working very hard. At the time, I was the reserve counterpart to the head of Standards Branch of the Marine Corps. So in other words, we were writing all the job descriptions of every military occupation specialty in the Marine Corps, which was quite something, especially in the aviation area, where pilots in every type of aircraft that the Marine Corps had have to go through hoops every year in order to keep their qualification. So if you're an F-18 pilot, you don't just go and check out an F-18 and go have a joyride. You have to literally perform certain things during your experience. And so I was all on that track to make myself a general, but boom, I had that accident. in 1990, and that was the end of my Marine Corps career. And that was, I'm convinced that that was my psyche, my deep God image saying, I don't want you doing that. What are you doing that for? and so in the Grail legend and in mythology, it's we talk about Tristan and Isolde, and in Tristan and Isolde, there's Amfortas, who is an old knight who has a wound that won't heal, and it's a wound in his leg, and it's called the Amfortas wound, and that's what I have. That's what I got that day, January 4th, 1990. I got my Amfortas wound, and it hasn't healed yet. I'm hoping to be able to drive from next week again, and I have a brand new stainless steel ankle, but I've been living with that for 28 years. Okay, so Euripides Ghost says, it gave me a comfort working with the irrationality and emotion and chaos that veterans live in. Certainly we do. If you ever wonder why Dad never talked about his experience in the war, this is why. And I had a relatively mild experience in Vietnam. I was in Vietnam 9 months, but I was not an infantry officer. I was an interrogation officer. So remember Abu Ghraib in Iraq? Well, I was the head of the POW camp in my location, and I was the head interrogator for a certain team in my group, but we never did anything like that, and we were trained not to do it. We were trained that it was a violation of the Geneva Convention, so I never even considered doing anything like they were doing. But I had a mild experience, and but nonetheless, I did go to the field many times, and I took a lot of helicopter rides, and I had a lot of big guns going off around me during my Vietnam time. And, you know, I came back from Vietnam, I thought I was perfectly fine. And that summer, I came back in April, and that summer my father-in-law took us out on the Niagara River in his Chris Craft boat for July 4th. You know, and I was just out there having a good time, drinking beer, just like any other American. And when the fireworks started that evening over Niagara Falls, I nearly jumped out of the boat. I was amazed how my body just instinctually took over. And nowadays, it hasn't changed any. It hasn't gotten any better in the, I don't know, 30-some years, 40 years that I've been back from Vietnam. It's 45 years or so since I've been back from Vietnam. But I can't go watch fireworks. I sometimes watch the National Mall on television, but if I go outside and listen to actual fireworks, it just drives me right up the wall. And the other thing that does is a helicopter flying over. Either one of those events puts me right back in Vietnam, and that's totally irrational, it's totally emotional, and as I say, my experience was quite mild. And so it was interesting. My father-in-law, he was a petty officer in the Navy, and he was assigned to the Navy Armed Guard, and so every merchant ship in the merchant fleet during World War II had 5 sailors aboard and 1 5-inch gun, which these sailors would operate in the event that the convoy was attacked. And he had himself a fine old time. He didn't smoke, but at one point he played poker well enough that he owned every cigarette on the ship. But when he came back from the war, he never talked about it. And it was only when I came along and I was a military man who had some war experience, and then he told all these stories about things that had happened to him during the war. And my wife and my mother-in-law had never heard these stories. And, you know, this is what happens. Men that come back from battle, they simply can't talk about it. And I actually heard Jordan Peterson talk about PTSD the other day, and he said PTSD is easy to understand because it's very naive men having a, you know, chaotic experience that's beyond their ability to cope with it. And you know, that sounds pretty accurate, I suppose, that, you know, young men are stupid enough so they'll go to war. And, you know, keeping in mind,
you learn fast, though, don't they?
Yeah, you learn fast, and then you realize how awful it really is. And
that comes through in Remarque's novel and the movies All Quiet on the Western Front.
Right.
It's very, very profound introduction to that
Absolutely.
topic.
Yeah. There's this naivety that people have, and you know, the military is a young man's game, and it's a young man's game only because they can only get young men to do it. You know, they get that warrior archetype constellated, and then they want to run off to war. So I was reading an account today of how Dr. Jung was coming back from Inverness at the beginning of World War I. He happened to be in Inverness giving a lecture when World War I broke out, and he came back coming across the lines of the opposing enemies before the war really got started. And he said he got across the German lines, and it was like a celebration. It was a feast day. And, you know, he went into the train station, and the people in the restaurants were just giving sandwiches away. And, you know, he crossed the lines, and there were tents where they were giving beer away, and everybody was in this really high mood and so on. Which,
euphoria.
Yeah, which is a kind of euphoria that goes with the warrior archetype. And then, oh my God, that's what it's about. You know?
This happened also with the Boer War with the British.
Absolutely.
In London, they had crowds coming out and people enlisting by the thousands.
Sure.
Overnight.
And, yeah, and even in the United States, they were having
and waving flags and throwing confetti and in the streets and everything.
Right, and people don't understand what that warrior archetype is about, and then later on they find out very painfully.
Skip, do these PTSD sufferers, do they tend to open up in therapy? Or do they
I don't know. We'd have to ask Euripides Ghost, because do you find that you can get PTSD patients to open up in therapy? I wonder if you'll respond to that, or if you don't feel you can, please let us know. Okay, so the next question, Euripides Ghost may have left us, but Miles asks, what does ion mean? Ion is the name of a god who is the god that's on the cover of the Ion book. And if you go to my reading of Ion, you will find a picture of Ion, which is a god that has a lion's head, and he has a snake wrapped around him. And this is the God at the beginning of the universe, basically, and it's from him that everything emanates.
Is that a Gnostic figure?
Let's see, was it Gnostic? I guess it was Gnostic, yeah. But anyway, Jung always acknowledged that he was a heretic. So, so let's see. Miles says Jungian thinking might be the higher level thinking Einstein said we will need in order to survive. Einstein said we need higher thinking in 1946. I think that that's fair enough. We certainly need something like that, because if we keep doing all these logos things without thinking, without allowing the fact that we have to have life in this logos, we're going to have a big problem. Now, Jerome says, my father was World War II airplane pilot, never talked about it, and would not get on an airplane for the rest of his life. And I know exactly how he felt, Jerome, because, you know, even though we've been at peace in Vietnam for over 40 years, I have no interest in going back there. I've flown over Da Nang on a commercial airlines route a couple of times at 8 miles in the sky, but I could see Da Nang from the sky. But aside from that, I never had any interest in going back to Vietnam, and still don't. And ironically, I went to Japan 17 years after World War II, and I was totally clueless. Unfortunately, I don't know what had happened. I guess we'd killed so many Japanese that they wouldn't dare do anything to a 15-year-old American boy, I suppose. But I recall one time that I got lost on the trains late at night. I got on the wrong train at 12 o'clock at night, and thinking it was the local that was going to take me back to where I was living, and instead it was an express train that took me 2 hours away from where my home was. And I got off the train at 2 in the morning, and it was pitch black. There was one like 50-watt bulb on the railroad platform, and it was dark. I was 15 years old, and I had no idea what might happen to me. I'd cut my teeth growing up before that on Guadalcanal Diary and things like that. And so, anyway, fortunately, the Japanese completely changed after the war and became total pacifists, really. And so not only was I safe, but when I went back 16 years later with 2 little girls, one of them, 6, and one of them about 4, I had no hesitation about putting them on the Tokyo subways by themselves to go to school, which was amazing. And we never had any problem. And I always felt safe on the streets of Japan. And I lived there 8 years total, 3 years in high school and 3 years in business. So Euripides Ghost says, the VA has unfortunately focused exclusively on a medical model of understanding and treating PTSD. The treatments can help. Yes, once you establish a relationship with them by demonstrating trustworthiness, they open up very deeply. I'm curious whether you yourself had experience in the military, Euripides Ghost. But anyway, veterans with PTSD are very sensitive to insincerity of people putting on airs or trying to comfort or trying to control or manipulate them. Cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure are fairly reliable at effecting symptom reduction, but veterans have to be willing to follow the protocol, to do the exercises, etc. I mean, what I can say from my personal experience is that I have never reduced my symptoms, which, as I say, were mild. But they are also reliable. Every time a helicopter flies over, I am back in Vietnam, definitely. And every time I watch a fireworks display, I want to dive for cover. And so I've gotten to the point where I just don't go watch them any longer. And I'm doubtful that that can be affected. But at the same time, I do believe that my study of Jungian psychology has helped me. And in effect, Dr. Jung has become my therapist. It's interesting. Dr. Jung was with an Indian fellow once, and he asked the Indian, who was a professional, probably a psychologist or some sort of holy man that was visiting him in Kusnacht, and he said, "Do you have a guru?" And the Indian said, "Oh yes, I have a guru. My guru is so-and-so." And Dr. Jung said, "Do you mean the sage that lived in the 13th century?" And the Indian said, "Yes, I mean him. He's my guru." Yeah. And it's interesting, in the 90s, I used to refer to Joseph Campbell as my guru, because before I got into Jung, I was reading a lot of Campbell. And I guess I did that because we read Edith Wharton's Mythology when I was in high school. And so somehow I had an urge to understand what we were studying and why in high school, and I started reading Campbell, and I read his biography, which is quite fascinating, called Fire in the Mind. And so I was reading him a lot, but then I sort of soured on him when I was listening to one of his audio tapes once, and he was asked by a woman student, "What is the meaning of life?" And he says, "Oh, there's no meaning of life. There's only an experience of life." And it was just the way he said it that just turned me off. And, ironically, now as I look at it through a Jungian lens, I understand that, experience is everything. And that's what the video at the beginning of this evening was about, where Jung said, Jaffe said, traditional religion posits, if you believe, you will have the experience of God. And Jung turns it around and says, if you have the experience of God, of the self, you will believe, or more precisely, you will know. And I think that's the way it has become for me. I don't know about anybody else, but go ahead.
Yeah, Skip, I just wanted to, just in the notes anyway, or in the chat, see if Euripides, I had a question for Euripides Ghosts about what he said about PTSD and manipulation, and I just was not understanding why there would be a connection between fear of manipulation and PTSD. So I just wanted to throw that out, that I was curious about that.
Well, I think that there is a certain fear of manipulation that is constellated when you're in battle, which is that you don't have any choice. You're trained, and there are no choices in the military. You are going to do what your superior officers tell you to do, and
So you get very sensitive to that?
Well, and very often you do what they tell you to do, and somebody next to you, your best friend, might suddenly be dead. And so taking off orders and being manipulated in that way can get to be very difficult. And I can imagine how it must be. I mean, I did not serve in the infantry per se, although I was with infantry units a number of times. But the infantry per se was in the field. They'd go to the field for like 6 weeks and then come back and take replacements for 2 weeks, and then they'd go to the field for 6 weeks again. That wasn't my experience. But you know, guys that were fighting booby traps, for example, you know, tripwires and things like that. And, you know, all of a sudden some lieutenant gives somebody an order and they distract the guy from what he's supposed to be looking at, and all of a sudden, boom, that guy's dead. Well, you know, after you have a couple of experiences like that, yes, you are going to distrust people giving you specific instructions. So let's see. Experience is very helpful. I'm glad to hear that. Very consistent with what many veterans say as well. For some, we take more of a coping-based approach if they find it helpful. You know, I think that Dr. Jung's advice about how to deal with dissociation with neurosis is good advice, which is that you're never going to cure it, but you can grow out of it. And so, you know, in my case, my PTSD is something that has been, I wouldn't say it's been shrunk down, but my psyche has grown very dramatically. And so it's no longer a driving thing in my life. In fact, it never has been. As I said, mine is very mild and only happens with those two triggers. But it never has gone away, and it's never gotten less. It's just that I've gotten bigger, and I know it's there. I know to expect it when these triggers occur, and I know how to deal with it. And so what reading and studying Dr. Jung's work for me has been a way to grow my psyche and grow my way of thinking about these things. But the veteran has to engage in specific treatment steps because she is motivated to do so, not because I want them to do so. This can be very tricky. Many traumatized people have significant difficulty trusting experience. They watch you very carefully, and you have to be sincere. I would certainly expect that. I like the metaphor of how an oyster grows a pearl around an irritant. The memories do not go away, but new experience along a dimension of growth, as you described, can be helpful. Yes, I definitely. And the only caveat I would have about the specific treatment plan steps, I mean, that sounds like a very logos-oriented approach, and you know, I'm sure that in our medical manuals, I suppose, there are very specific treatment steps that you have to follow, and if you don't follow them, then you've committed malpractice. I'm not sure that that's 100% perfect, because it leaves out the Eros side of what Dr. Jung taught, and that is life. And so I tend to be operating these days as a kind of compensation to my thinking tendency. I tend to be a T type of person in the context of the Myers-Briggs type indicator and not a feeling person. But Dr. Jung has taught me to recognize and pay attention to my feelings, my emotions, and so on. And somehow, if you're not familiar with Dr. Jung's psychological types, that would be probably something that would be very useful. That was one of his early books, and I'm not sure if you would use something like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, but there are very quick ways to get a handle on it. So Euripides goes says INFP here. Well, you're you're in good company, because my friend John sitting here next to me is an INFP. I'm an INTP, but I've learned to pay attention to my F side, and I know that that's a very important aspect. But as a, I don't know, I think a rigid structure I would tend to resist. I don't know why. It may be because I'm also not only N, but very N. I'm in the 99th percentile on the N side. And so I don't tend to like detail. I like to see the big picture of something. And I think if people tend to be intuitive, they tend to see the big picture without understanding the details. And perhaps some of your patients who resist may be in that category. I'm not sure, but that's what comes to mind. Therapy gives me the opportunity to be creative along with the veteran. But yes, I think that the veteran's patients will often resist too much structure in therapy. Yeah, I think that that's fair enough. And for some of them who are intelligent enough, I would encourage you to have them read some of these simpler Jungian books. Not Jung himself, because Jung himself speaks in a very complex German manner. I think that's how I would describe it. His books tend to be English translated directly from the German into English, but they haven't translated the German way into the American way of thinking. And so for Americans, sometimes Dr. Jung's work is difficult because he tends to think in backward kind of ways. I mean, even this that's not a very good example, but there are a couple of excellent books that I can definitely recommend. One is Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman. Both of those books are by Jean Shinoda Bolen, and those books tend to tell people about how they are in the world from a Greek god point of view. And I think that they're very helpful. I'm going to put the names here on the chat. Those are very entertaining books and very useful. And they might help patients think about themselves, because I wouldn't say they're simplistic. They're by PhD Jungians, or by PhD Jungian, but she gives 8 archetypes for each system, for the masculine and for the feminine. And right away you can see yourself in these archetypes. I mean, the 2 that resonate with me are Hephaestus, which in the Roman context is Vulcan, the blacksmith at his forge, and Hermes, which in the Roman context is Mercury. And Hermes is someone who goes into the unconscious, into hell, and brings something back for the rest of us to think about. And that's something that I obviously do with more than 570 videos on this channel. I obviously am trying to bring something up for other people to see and understand. And Hephaestus was sort of the architect of the gods who was hammering things together. And obviously putting together a YouTube channel, as I have done, is exactly that. So you can see both of my primary archetypes right in this work that I do on this channel. Let's see.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Do you know if Jung treated any CPTSD or PTSD patients from after the war, after World War I?
Well, he certainly saw many, because he was, during World War I, he was serving on active duty for 10 months. Oh. And he was, because all Swiss men serve in the military, that's mandatory. During World War I, he was in his late 30s. I don't know what his official rank was, but I do know that he was at one point a POW camp commander, as I was. same role.
Did he ever write about his treatment of PTSD patients?
I'm not sure he ever wrote about that per se. I can't put my finger on anything specifically that he wrote about that, but I'm sure there must be mention of it in some of his papers. Certainly, there's mention of his experience as a POW camp commander, and it was during that time that was part of his visioning period, when he was having the Red Book visions while he was this POW camp commander. And he was already starting to formulate his ideas about mandala. And so during this period, he was drawing a mandala every day while he was up in battle. Or he wasn't in battle, but he was facing men who had been injured and even enemy men, because it was a POW camp. Mm-hmm. So he was being exposed to English prisoners and so on. And I guess the Swiss had agreed to serve as a POW camp, even, as a neutral POW camp, even though they hadn't gotten into the war. But I do think that he did treat many men, because I do remember at one point he says that by 1919 he knew that World War II would come, because he was seeing it in the visions and dreams of his patients. So he must have had a lot of military men, and they were having this revenge reaction that just definitely indicated that they were going to be sort of fresh meat for another war because they wanted revenge for what had happened to them in World War One. And so Euripides Ghost says, fragmentation of the self just seems such a central complication of PTSD. Jung's work cannot help but be relevant. That's certainly true. I mean, I think it's true of everyone, not only PTSD patients, but I do think that all of us have fragments of ourself that are hanging around, and we have to pull that together. I mean, that's what Dr. Edinger talks about, the conjunctio, that's an objective of Jungian psychology, which is to bring the opposites together and make ourselves whole. And that obviously is a very central idea to Jungian psychology. Jerome says, IAJS Jung Studies Network PTSD can post link on the chat. Yes, okay, by all means do post a link on the chat. We can all benefit from that. I'm going to say goodbye to my friend John, who lives an hour away and is kind enough to come here every week. So as you depart, let me just mention that this meeting will be at Sammy's next Monday. And so for the rest of you, for people that are watching our group outside of the Annapolis region, if you're in Annapolis, you're certainly welcome to join us. But we will not be broadcasting next week because we have one member who's reticent about that, let's say. And so peace. Take care. So I'll see you at Sammy's next week.
Okay.
Yep. Anyway, we will not broadcast this group next week. I will consider what I should do as a substitute for this, because obviously the group outside of Annapolis has become important to what I'm doing. And so I do want to have further sessions that all of you can also participate with. They won't be on Monday night, at least not for the next week, and then we'll see. But in any case, I would welcome any ideas about times, including weekend times. I'm relatively free every day. I'm 71 years old, so I'm retired, or at least pretty semi-retired, and I can pretty much be available anytime. So if there's suggestions about times that would be better for doing this kind of conversation, please let me know. Today, during the afternoon or the morning, I did a reading that the video that began this session came from that reading. And as an experiment, I just turned the live stream on and I did my reading, and it's unedited. People like Miles had the experience of seeing all my speech impediments and so on as I did my reading, but people seem to have liked that. And so it was, what I did was I did my reading, and every 5 minutes or so I would stop and answer questions that came up on the chat, and that seemed to have worked very well. So what I can consider doing is trying to do that at a regular time every day, or 3 days a week or whatever it is. If today I was online for 2 hours and I can't edit the video I can't edit a 2-hour video that fast. So maybe I can do that 2 or 3 times a week at a time that might be helpful to people. And so that would be you seeing the raw me reading some book, but at the same time, I would be available to answer questions for anybody who wanted to ask. So I'm just experimenting. But other than that, the scheduled time that we have currently regularly is a course I'm trying to run on Answer to Job. And we're trying to do that regularly on Thursday at 1:30 p.m. We've done 4 sessions so far. We're up to about paragraph 575, which isn't very far yet into this book because the book begins at paragraph 553 and it ends at 758. Those numbers are paragraphs in the Collected Works, volume 11, and so they don't go 1 to 205 or whatever it is. And so we're still at the beginning of Answer to Job. We haven't really gotten into the really controversial material that is in Answer to Job. That tends to come a little bit later. But I am going to make every effort to get through paragraph 608 this Thursday, and I have posted combined videos of my reading of everything up to paragraph 608 is on the YouTube channel under the Answer to Job playlist. So you might want to listen to that reading before Thursday, and then we'll have a conversation about it on Thursday. I'm combining with Answer to Job, I'm combining Dr. Edinger's book. Let's see, we have it within reach, that is the question. Yes, I do. Okay, so I'm combining with the Answer to Job discussion Dr. Edward Edinger's book, Transformation of the God Image, and this book does include Dr. Edward Edinger's 11 or 10 lectures on Answer to Job. And so what I am doing is combining my own reactions, the actual reading of Answer to Job, plus the high points of Dr. Edinger's lectures. So this Thursday I will be going through the 9 points that Dr. Edinger covers on the paragraphs 577 to 608. And I'll be happy to chat with all of you about it. And if you've read it in advance, that'll be very helpful. Let's see now. Let's see, Euripides goes, thank you so much for the channel, the delightful conversation, the resource. Wow, I'd love the opportunity to be part of the discussion about Answer to Job. I hope you can join us at that time, and if you can't make it at that time, obviously there are recordings of our sessions, and so the first 4 sessions are already available, and I am responsive to anything that goes onto the YouTube channel. So even if you can't participate in the live chat, if you put comments under the video version, I will certainly reply. But I'm actually rather excited that I'm able to interact with people in this way. I've looked at other alternatives for interaction, and one alternative is the Google Hangouts. And the problem with that is it only allows up to 10 participants, and we already are getting more than 10 on this, and we also have people that are coming in and out. And so in order for people to be on the YouTube or on the Google Hangout, I need their email address so I can invite them to the Google Hangout, and that becomes very cumbersome when we have in the course of 1 2-hour period we have many people coming in and out of the conversation. So that would be a bit cumbersome. It works well for interviews or for just one-on-one discussions, which I'm willing to do with people. But for now, I think I have to rely on something like this. The other alternative is to do a webinar, but I'm sorry to say I don't have the funds to commit to pay for a webinar functionality for a lot of people. And so for now, we're limited to this, and I hope that you can join if you want to be supportive of the channel. Certainly you're welcome to go to the Patreon page. I have a very small Patreon following at the moment, which doesn't come anywhere close to covering the expenses that I incur in putting the Archetype in Action website and this YouTube channel together, but it's a start. And sometime soon we're going to pass the 1,000 subscriber level, and when we do that, YouTube probably will start putting advertising on the channel, and the way to defeat that is to become a YouTube Red member. Now that will cost you $10 a month, but there's a reason for doing that, and one reason is that it stops all advertising on any YouTube channel that you look at, and the other is that you support the people that whose videos you actually watch. So let's suppose that if you put in $10 a month and 25% of the videos that you watch in a month are my videos, then I would get $2.50 of your $10 as my contribution out of your membership, and the rest would be divided up with the other producers of the videos. And so you know, that's seems like a worthwhile thing to do, not only for me. I mean, okay, I'm retired and I have my Social Security and so on, but you know, there are a lot of young people that are making videos, and some of them are singing 3-minute songs and so on, so it's much harder for them to earn money. And if you can support them in some way just by the fact that you've watched their video, that would be helpful to them, and it certainly would be helpful to me. You know, I've invested in a fair amount of equipment here in order to be able to do a reasonable live broadcast on a regular basis, and so it's still a nonprofit activity, very definitely, but it would be nice to be able to cover some of the expenses. That would be very helpful. So anyway, it's not required. I'm totally committed to doing my Jungian work, as you can see, and I've been doing it regularly, even in this reading group, for nearly 2 years now. And so I intend to be here as long as my voice holds up. Anyway, so it's very nice to have you. Let me just check. So Euripides Ghost is going to review the playlist, and Dan says, late to the party again. Well, Dan, within probably a half an hour, this video will be available as a unique video on this YouTube channel. It won't be on this link, but if you look for it on the YouTube channel, you can probably find it pretty easily. So I urge you to take a look. And so all these sessions that I've been broadcasting do have the live feed videos available. So anyway, I'm going to keep trying to do live stream. I think it's useful. I'm happy that I've met some people online here who do have a serious interest in what Dr. Jung is talking about. I'm thinking particularly of Miles and Jerome and Dan Bales and Gray Yates, who've been quite regular on some of these sessions, and there have been others. There's Arcadian Wings, who is from Belgium, and I have a follower from Sweden and another very regular follower from Bulgaria, but unfortunately these reading group sessions on Monday nights are too late for my European followers, and so I apologize to them. That is why I try to do some during the business day to make it a little easier for them, to get them in their early evening. But if there are other questions, so Euripides Ghost says, sorry, you may have said Wednesday night. What about Wednesday night? What I said, I haven't specified another night as yet, but what I did specify was that the Answer to Job class I'm conducting at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Thursday afternoon. I understand that may be difficult for someone who's working at a VA hospital, but anyway, that's the time we've been doing it, and the videos of those sessions are available, and I'll look for other times that may work not only for you but for me. It may not be Monday night for a period of time. We'll see. I need to check back with my group. As some of you know, I had my ankle replaced on Valentine's Day, and as of now I'm walking around with a boot, but my wife isn't allowing me to drive yet, and so hopefully by next Monday I'll be able to drive and be able to go back to the haunt where we have been hanging out for the last 2 years. And then I have to negotiate with my live members about whether we're going to broadcast those sessions or not. There's a couple that are a little reticent about participating if we're broadcasting live, because they trusted if I can edit what is said, but broadcasting live means that they have to be very careful about what they say, and so I have to balance that. So anyway, next week, Monday, there will not be a session that will be broadcast, but there will be other sessions during the week as I work out how I can do my other work and do my regular Answer to Job class, which I am intending to treat as sort of a graduate level course on Dr. Jung's important book, Answer to Job. And I have taught at the graduate level in the University of Maryland, and I've actually taught in university level, including graduate level, for 7 years in night school as an adjunct professor. And so I know something about the pedagogical approach, and so I will continue to do that. And in the view of trying to make it a course that anybody could pick up 5 years from now and work their way through Answer to Job. That's my intention. And so if you can participate in that, I would be very happy to have you. So anyway, I will see the Answer to Job group on Thursday at 1:30. Otherwise, until I work out a regular timing for my readings, you'll just have to notice if I've gone online. And those sessions are going to be a bit raggedy because I'm trying to read and also be responsive to the chat. And we did our first one today, and it seems to have gone quite well. There were quite a few people that participated over the period, and the videos have been viewed a number of times since we stopped this afternoon. And so that looks like a very promising approach for the future. But we only did it for the first time today, so I'm still working out the details. Okay, so at this point I'm going to say goodnight. My voice, I've done this for actually 5 hours today, so I'm kind of at the end of my voice's rope. And I will say goodnight and see you on Thursday, and maybe before. I may do another session before then. But anyway, peace. And it's nice to meet the new folks that have joined us tonight. See you soon.